I will talk about some topics that I am familiar with: economic outlook, long-term evolutions, and innovations in France. This is a summary of my speech. Mhm. And we know that the world is after the COVID, since 2020, and we can see that after this COVID, the countries find the way to recovery. We can see that in Europe, in US, and in France, we have some new growth road, new growth path, and what we can say is that the Chinese economy is also find history the growth, and in 2022, because of the COVID policy very restrictive in China, the growth was very low. But in 2023 and 2024, the OECD and the IMF forecast we can say that we will find the lower growth path in China. But but we can see that in the future years, the IMF is a little bit pessimistic about the Chinese growth from 2025. But and from my point of view, I think I will be a little bit more optimistic. And for France, because it's a developed country, and the growth rate are much lower than China. But the problem for France is lower than the US. I will talk about in the following minutes that the gap between France and the US is more and more stronger. And what we can see in 2023 and 2024, the growth rate for China is I think is very good. But even the growth rate from India is higher. But the base, the basis of calculation is much lower. This is why even we have a growth rate lower, but the wealth created by the growth is much bigger than the India. The long-term evolution and the perspective, what we can say is that from China, we have 40 years of the rapid growth. And from 1920 to 2010, the average growth rate is at more than 10% of a year. But the more than 10% of a year seems very high. But the basis is very low. This is why we have a very high growth rate, but the credit wealth is much lower. Now we have the 4.5, for example, from 20 to 28. But now the wealth created is very, very stronger than in the past. This is a U.S. annual growth rate, and I will talk it after. This is the France is very low. And what we can say is for the COVID, France is the most impacted country, because in 2020 we have a negative growth of 8%. In the same time, Chinese growth was positive. And in the US is much lower, the growth, the negative growth. Alors, we can say that even with the COVID crisis, the Chinese growth almost is always positive. This is why that the Chinese economy is a very resilient, and they also have a stronger motor of growth, I think. And if we see the absolute level of GDP, we can say that from 2020, from 1980 to 2028, the GDP of China, the Chinese GDP is multiplied by 49 times. But US GDP is only 3 times more. And France is only 221. This is why the China is becoming the second largest GDP bloc. And if we can see that the okay. And from 90 to 2028, the Chinese GDP is multiplied 20 times more. Also, is very impressive. And even for the current time from 2020 to 2028, the growth multiplier for China is also much longer, much stronger than US and France. And if we compare it, for example, in 1980, the Chinese GDP is only 42% of France, but the China is 20 times more, 20 times bigger, and the current and now. Chinese economy is eight times the GDP. This is why when we have a different growth speed, we have a different result. And when China was very poor, France was the richest, one of the richest country. But now the Chinese people are growing very rapidly. The GDP is eight times more than the French one. And if we compare the Chinese economy to the US economy, in 1991, the Chinese economy is 11% of the GDP of US. But now, currently, we are at 71%. And in 10 years, it's 85% of US. And in 2035, normally, the Chinese GDP will become the first one, larger than the US one. And I think when the Chinese GDP is the second largest one, the world is changing. And when in 10 years, the GDP of China will become the first one, I think the world will be changed by the Chinese people. This is, I think, many people in the world don't see this phenomenon. And I can give another number. Is that even at 6% of 6% of growth rate in China, the created wealth in China is one third of the French GDP. This means that every 3 years, the Chinese GDP, the growth is one French GDP. This every 3 years we have a new France. This is why for the French people we must see, we must know, we must understand another people who is creating much more wealth with their growth path. And in China, even the GDP will become the first in about 2035, but the GDP per capita in China is very low because in China we are 1,400,000,000 people, but in US we have only 3 million. Oh no. 300 million people in US. And in, and in 2070, the Chinese, okay. And why the Chinese economy is developing very quickly? We have another phenomenon in China is the urbanization. Is urbanization because in 1950, with the Chinese urban people, we have only 64 million people of China were urban people. All the country, all the Chinese people were in the rural, in the country. But now in 2020, we are 884 million people. This means, what does this mean? It means that each year we have 20 million new urban people. 20 million urban people, new urban people, this if we construct a new city of 20 million people. This is why each year we must construct the infrastructure, the energy, the airport, the metro. Each year we must construct this sense for the 20 new urban people. But in France, the urbanization process is almost finished. The construction process is a very low level. This is why the Chinese economy will grow very rapidly in the past, but they will grow more and more slowly, but at a very high level. And this will last to 2050, because at this, in that year, in 2050, the urbanization rate in China is almost the same level of the current France. In France, we are 80% of French people are in the city, and in China, it will be up almost in 2050. This is why China says that in 2050, China will become the rich country, because now we are developing. We are developing now. We are not the rich country. We are not poor country. We are not poor country, and this is one of the objective. 100 years after the Republic, 2049, and when at the end of the urbanization process, we don't need to construct new cities. This is why in this year, we have no new urban people. But this one, we have 20 million new urban people now, this year. And at that time, the growth rate will be almost the same level like in developed countries, like in France, in Germany, because the urbanization process is finished. And the Chinese GDP per capita in 2003 is very, very low compared to the USA. But in 2075 or in 2050, the Chinese GDP per capita will be much higher than now, and will be about 1/3 of the US. This means that Chinese economy will be 3 times more, bigger than the U.S. In that time, the Chinese economy will become the biggest economy ever in the world history. And I think this is a trend that we cannot stop. If China doesn't make any mistake like the Cultural Revolution, this process cannot be stopped. And I'm very sure that the Chinese people will, the country of China will become 3 or 4 times stronger in terms of the GDP than US in 2050 and in 2030, 75. And if we why the growth rate is very strong in China, in US than in France? I think we have the process. Another process is the innovation. For example, in China, the urbanization needs to construct new buildings, new offices. Only the construction of new offices is innovation, is absolute innovation than the country life. Because in the country we had a lesson, we have no school, no hospitals, but in the city, everything is new. Everything new. It's the absolute innovation compared to the country level. And the U.S. economy is much more dynamic than the French, because they have an innovation process much stronger. What we can say is that U.S. and France is almost the same level in terms of GDP per capita in 2010. But we are now US is here, France is here, China is here. This gap is an innovation process between US and France. And this is why French President Emmanuel Macron launched an innovation plan, France 2030. France 2030. I think this is a very, very good decision from the French state. Because in the past 40 years, many industries in France were moved in China or in other countries, but the most is in China. And this plan, this plan, where the objective of this plan is to recreate the innovation process in France and to sustainable growth in France. I think if the plan will have a good success, maybe France will refine the growth rate, but I'm not very optimistic, because compared to US and China, the volume of investment is too small. For example, the Apple company, the capitalization of Apple company is $3,000 million dollars, and this is higher than the French GDP. Is only one company, and in France we don't have such company of innovation. This is very difficult. And the objective of France 2030, first one is to keep the leadership of the existing sectors of France, and to recreate conditions for other sectors to become the leaders. this is, well, the investment is about 54 billion euros during 5 years. During 5 years, this means that each year we have investment of 10 billion euro. 10 billion euro for France is a big amount, big volume, but for US or for China, maybe it's not it's not even the volume of one company, for example. We have 10 targets of this plan. First one is decarbonization of production modes for energy, industry, and transport. Improve the quality of life. In France, this is one of the most important objectives. Food, health, and culture. The third is exploration of knowledge in space and in deep sea. This means to produce better, to live better, and to understand better. And I think in China also we have all these targets, maybe less in the culture, but in all the other sectors, or even more, all the sectors of industry, China have more investment in innovation. And better production, for example, in the energy sector, the target one is the new nuclear reactors in France. Target 2 is the leader in green hydrogen. And the target 3 is the process of the French industry. For example, in the France is very because in many countries, if the decarbonization are the factors to limit the production, maybe we will stop somewhere, or we will slow this process. But in France, no. We must do this because this is our objective in the mind, also in the action. And maybe by making this process, if we success in this process, maybe the fruits of this process in the future will be maybe much bigger. But this is why in China also, because in China in the past, we didn't agree with the decarbonization with our energy. But from 2015, China has changed completely the strategy, because in this direction, China has invested in the new energy sector, new energy transport, new energy, the public transport, and in all these sectors, China has become the leaders. This is why in changing this is an example for the idea and the action are in the same good direction. For the transport for the future, the target is to produce 2 million electric cars in France by 2030. This is a very ambitious plan, because in France the two current car makers are not very happy with the electric cars. But when they construct, when they don't construct the electric cars in France, other countries produce much more cars. This is the case for China, because China will produce 10 million electric cars in 2023, and maybe 20 million in 2025, and in 2030, China will maybe produce 30 million electric cars. Only more less than 10% of Chinese production. If we export these cars in France, I think this plan doesn't have no meaning compared to the Chinese plan. But this is why if the France with this innovation plan can construct the usine, the factories of cars in France by Chinese makers, I think the plan will be a success. Better life is food, health, and the culture. Well, in France, culture is very important. This is maybe it's the only country that the culture, the tourism, the leisure are also important. Then the industry or the government. The France doesn't neglect also in aerospace and the deep sea. And for example, this 300 million for the deep sea exploration. It's I think it's a very small volume compared to Chinese investment of innovation in this domain. But if we don't do, we are much more slower than Chinese people or than China. And with this innovation plan, donc the France have 6 levers for the raw materials, but unfortunately, in France we don't have any raw materials. This depends on China and other African countries. The components of electronic, digital technology, the innovation, and the financing. These are the conditions for the success of the innovation plan. Okay. With this innovation plan, France have an innovation process of governance because normally in the past, France innovation depends on the big companies because the big companies had much more money. But now it's the startup. The startups are very, very active in France. This is why this plan has many finance for these very small startups. And in France, we have a very complicated governance. But for this plan, the government try to simplify. I think from 2 years, the procedure is much more simplified for the process. And another aspect is the risk taking. This means that if you have investment in a project, you don't care that the risk, because the risk is financed by this plan. Okay, you must do your best for the success. The risk is financed by this innovation plan. Also, we have the tracking committees at the level of the ministries. This is a plan, is an open plan. Open plan means that if Chinese companies or other countries' companies have their subsidiaries in France, they can also participate to the innovation plan. The Chinese funded or foreign funded companies, French companies in France, can bid separately that only Chinese companies do this, or jointly with other French or Chinese funded French companies. But the Chinese companies in France, we have a little problem because the Chinese companies react as Chinese companies. When they do things in France, they must know the French system. They must react like a French one, like a Frenchman, like a French government, like a French companies, and they also strictly meet the technical specifications. Maybe in China, some bid process we use our relationships, but here we use the relationships is a very bad idea. It's a bad idea because the process is transparent. If somebody is involved in the choice, this can be seen by everybody. This is why it's better to do things correctly than this one. And for Chinese companies, if they participate in this plan, I think some Chinese technology are more advanced than the French one. If this technology can be made better with this plan, the product is at the end of this process can be remade in China and in France. And this is why I think is a win-win strategy if Chinese technologies are more efficient with this plan, because it's the government financing is cost nothing for the innovation companies. I think maybe for the Chinese companies, they have interest to do things with the French plan. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for my speech.